Many of you, you don't understand it, okay? But a lot of us who come from more Mediterranean, we get upset about things politically or religiously. You know? And many of us did it in America. Think about the civil rights movement. There were people who were very calm, people got upset. You know? Why is it people who are being victimized are not supposed to get upset? It's sort of like if somebody punches me in the face, I'm not supposed to say I really have to punch you back or I'll get you on another day. Well, then I'm not being a Christian. But if they were a Christian who did it somehow, you know. Or if somebody really addresses me down in public, that I should just answer them really calmly and not say, you know, you just said that I'm an idiot who doesn't know what I'm speaking about. Let me show you why you're an idiot who doesn't know. You know, somebody else said, John, you'd be much more effective if you just said, come, let us reason together. Let me just explain this. Well, I did that when I was younger, and now I don't quite do that. But growing up as a young Catholic, if you had a movie that violated the integrity of Jesus or the Virgin Mary, okay, many Catholics would have demonstrated, would have been shouting outside a place. Now, what's more liberal about it? We don't get upset. Well, you know, okay, I'm not trying to explain when people get violent, but I'm talking when people say, like, you know, why do people get emotive? Well, you know, I sometimes think, how do you explain? You know, when I tried to explain why people got upset with Salman Rushdie, it's funny, in the America of today, I couldn't come up with a lot of examples. You know, portraying, the prophet's wives as prostitutes. I try to think about, what could I say to a non-Muslim audience and say to them, well, you know, you'd really get upset if somebody portrayed your mother and sister in this way, or we live in a society where, you know, we think that great artists, even if we object to it, you know, that obviously they have a right to put a crucifix, you know, or to defecate on it, and then make it, you know, put it out there. Okay, I like to be a little expansive in my examples, but sorry about that. Okay, so what do Muslims want? Respect, and they want freedoms. And they don't get it from most of their governments. Okay. And B, who helps them? Who helps their governments? Often, with a number of the authoritarian governments, they're our chief allies. And how do we help many of our allies? Not only with economic aid, but with military aid. We not only provide extensive military aid, we train their military. During the Iranian Revolution, I used to fly down from Boston, and I'd fly into Baltimore, because the fares were cheaper. This was my struggling academic days. Then take a bus up to D.C. or a cab. The advantage of taking a cab, because I was going to now, you know, discuss Iran, was that I had ex-Iranian generals driving the cab, okay? And they would tell me how they were trained in America, as indeed Egyptian military and others, and Latin American, etc. Okay? These are the things that, you know, people get concerned about. Okay. But what about the challenges then? And what about the causes of terrorism? Data shows that the primary drivers of terrorism and of suicide bombing. Read a book called Dying to Win, for example. Really great book. It's been updated in a book called Cutting the Fuse. But if you want to look at Dying to Win, its author is Robert Pape, P-A-P-E. Because we're all busy in our lives, Google them, and you'll be able to get a seminal article that came out before the book. The article is as good as the book. It's a short tract, okay? And the title of the article will reveal itself. What we discover is that the primary driver, more often than not always, but more often than not, are political grievances. Religion becomes a way to legitimate and motivate. If you look at the early speeches of Osama bin Laden, he plays on political grievances and then goes on to say to Muslims, and cast it in religious terminology, why there's an us and them world, why we can now throw out the regulations of Islamic law, that you can't kill civilians, you know, that war has to be proportional, you know, why we can reinterpret certain texts of the Quran, and now see Jews and Christians and even other Muslims as the enemy. And then the final observation is the question of, well, what about Islamic reform? You know, is there reform in the Muslim world, and where do we go from here in terms of our relations? First of all, let's understand reform. Many of us will say what Muslims need is Islamic reformation. Okay? Well, that just shows how religiously illiterate we are. Because if you really understood the Reformation, you wouldn't have wanted to live during those times. The Reformation, as we know, was not just about discussing theological differences and Protestants breaking away from Catholics because of theology. You had 100 years of religious wars. You know, Catholics were killing Protestants, Protestants were killing Catholics. In greater numbers. No, that's the way I was educated. No, whatever the numbers were. Catholics were killing Protestants, all doing it in the name of Jesus, the Gospels, and religion. So I kid with my Muslim friends sometimes, and I say, aha, when they call for a reformation, they want a Muslim genocide. That's what they're really talking about. They want a civil war, and, you know, it's not. But keep that in mind, because what I'm really saying is that you see the strains for reform in Muslim societies, which are driven by both political and religious realities. The Reformation was driven by both political and religious realities, okay? You see those strains in the fact that on the one hand, you see a struggle over religious reinterpretation, what's called ijtihad. But you also see that at times things get messy. At times there is violence between extremist Muslims and mainstream Muslims, okay? And those that basically say, you're kuffar, you're an unbeliever. Now, when we hear the word kuffar, unbeliever, we think, it's a bad word, you know, they use it. But that's exactly what we did between Catholics and Protestants in the old days. We had our own term. You know, we learned the English term, but there were German terms, there were, you know, Italian terms, etc., for rejecting the other, for saying now and justifying how we could kill a fellow Christian. Well, how can you do that? Christians don't kill Christians, so what you've got to be able to do is set up a bar that now says you're outside the pale, you know? Okay. In terms of reform itself, and in my book, The Future of Islam, I have a whole chapter on this. It's a little sensitive the way I did it. I changed the title, but I still use the phrase inside. Where are the Billy Grahams? You know, where are the Martin Luthers and Billy Grahams? I don't like that phrase, but for non-Muslims, I had a sense they would have a little bit of sense what I'm talking about. Where are the theological reformers, but also where are the popular preachers? Because we see that double phenomenon emerging. From North Africa to Southeast Asia, you have both clergy, if you will, religious leaders, and secular people, because this is exactly the way reform takes place. If you look at the Protestant Church, and if you look at Protestant churches, and if you look at Roman Catholicism and Vatican II, it wasn't just priests and theologians. Well, it was a lot of lay theologians who were involved also in these reforms. So you have reformers who are in effect saying, look, Islam is not something defined and fixed for all time. Yes, we look to the Quran and tradition, but many reformers will say that the interpretation of sacred scriptures, okay, which then yields tradition, okay, is important, it's a reference point. But many will say it's not sacrosanct. And the problem is when you make tradition sacrosanct. Some of my conservative Catholic friends will say, and they're very well educated, they'll be senior corporate executives who take their religion seriously. I'll say, well, you know, how can you hold, you know, that position is not for all times. The Catholics have held for centuries. I'll say, I don't see it in Gospels. Oh, it's in tradition. And at times, even though they're really bright and they study it, I'll say, we're in tradition. Well, I don't remember now, but it's kind of like, I know it's in tradition, and I've grown up with it. Now, very often they're right, it is in tradition, but what they don't know is the history of it. If they did, then they'd be saying, yeah, it's in tradition, but it didn't get defined until the 9th century. So, gee, if we didn't do it till the 9th century, then maybe not only wasn't it in the Gospels, but maybe it's a human construct which fit its times, but this is a part of the tradition that at least can be rediscussed and re-examined. Needless to say, you're more conservative and you're more, as the reformists, are at great odds about, they all agree about reform, but how much reform is possible or should occur. And so this is going on within the tradition. But within Islam, God, it feels better to walk around. I don't know what I have to say. I really don't say. I was beginning to feel very funny talking to you. My brain doesn't work as well. But as in our own traditions, the reality of it is, reformers are usually a vanguard. In other words, you know, religions develop, and you've got a majority position to use. When significant reform is called for within a tradition, often the institutions, not always, the keepers of the keys are more conservative, resistant to it, and so reformers have an upward struggle. In the Catholic Church, it used to be that the official church sort of felt, Who cares what they're saying in the ivory tower? You know, let those lay theologians say their stuff. Or it would be, hey, we're going to assert our authority, and we're going to say that in Catholic colleges and universities, you know, we're going to set the parameters for what a theologian can teach or not, and maybe even somebody in sociology. You know, can a good sociologist really address in a critical way the issue of birth control? Or abortion vis-a-vis fighting HIV in Africa? You know what I mean? Those kinds of issues. So it's a vanguard. And I remember this being a young Catholic theologian in another life at the time when the Pope put out the encyclical on birth control. The first question was, how can you question the papacy? This was an interesting, I don't know if most of you know it, the Pope set up a commission, and the commission voted. Anybody know what the vote was on the commission? It was unanimous to change the teaching, and Pope Paul decided not to. Pope Paul, who many of us saw as the guy who came after John the 23rd, and you know, going to be more of a reformer. Okay? And so a group of us, both clergy and non-were theologians, addressed that. But even in our own meetings, at a certain point, somebody said, well, you know, I've been talking to my religious superior. He raised an interesting question. Who really has authority even as a Catholic theologian? Don't you have to be trained in a seminary? Or at a pontifical university like Catholic University? In other words, even if you have a degree from a Catholic university, but it's not pontifical, and therefore under Rome formally, and you study the best people, etc. Really, you know, do you have authority to really speak on this? So it's a vanguard within the Muslim world, often caught between authoritarian leaders, okay, who want to manipulate these people or don't want them to come up with formulations that would be a problem, okay? Think about the problem that liberation theology had in Latin America. Both the conservative papacy and the authoritarian rulers said they're socialists and Marxists. It's obvious they were. The church was going out among the people. You don't do that. You know, the institutional church goes out among the people. You know. I was saying to somebody, you know, your idea now of planter pastors. In Roman Catholicism 30 years ago, 40 years ago in France, they began the worker priest movement. Official church was very suspicious. What were the worker priests? They were people who actually, priests that had this stupid idea that you go out among the people and you work in factories with them, and that's how you reach with them. And you don't wear your Roman collar, you dress like everybody else. You don't hide the fact that you're a priest, but you live and work with the people. And the church was very leery about that. Because, they weren't living in parish houses, and you couldn't be monitoring them all the time, etc. So you've got reformers. But reformers also have to deal with extremists in their society. Extremists who have a non-historical, monolithic interpretation of the faith, and in effect see this kind of reform as a threat. Extremists who see both the government as a threat and Islamic reformers as a threat. So we've got that form of reform. And with international communications, instead of people living in parts of the Muslim world isolated, just as they can know what's going on all over the Muslim world in a way that they didn't know, people are more, as it were, religiously literate or open to diverse interpretations. It's like we Christians. When you think about it, when preachers began to be on TV, or when you can access them with DVD, etc., then all of a sudden, you've got this panoply of people you're open to. So if you live in a little village someplace in America, it's not just your local pastor. And if you're going to be living there all your life, you put the TV on and you can see alternative people, even from your own denomination, etc. All of that's playing now. And there are attempts to both, promote it as well as silence it. And it means that a Muslim in one area can seek an opinion from a prominent Muslim religious scholar some other place in the world. They don't have to just deal with their local imam if they think their local imam doesn't know the time of day. Okay? At the same time, what we have is a phenomenon of popular preachers. One of the most prominent is a man named Amr Khaled, A-M-R-K-H-A-L-E-D. Google him. He gets more hits, at least at one time, Time magazine said more hits than Oprah Winfrey. Okay, Amr Khaled. A-M-R-K-H-A-L-E-D. But Amr Khaled is interesting because he began he's trained as a businessman, still has his companies, but began as a local preacher in Egypt, really caught on in the Arab world, and is now based in the UK and has a following in Europe. He can fill a football stadium when he speaks. Okay, a football stadium. And his message is is religious in the broadest sense, i.e., on the one hand, it's a religious message that tends to be on the more conservative side, but